the dirty secret about the family law is that it's a book-shaped thing. Really, it's just a bunch of stories, real life stories about growing up, smashed into book form. It doesn't really have a linear structure or anything like that, but it touches on all those issues that I talked about. This is the first iteration of that book. That's supposed to be me. It's supposed to represent me at the age of 12. At that time in your life where you're mortified by your family, where you think they're all freaks, and of course you grow older and more compassionate about your family and you realize, yes, they're freaks. They totally are freaks. But they make for great material. And that's then, bars over their eyes to represent the fact that they can't be identified, even though I fully use their real names inside the book. So that was the first cover of the book. We moved on from that one and we changed the cover to this after it sold out, I think because my publishers thought the first cover looked too much like a child abuse memoir. So we've got this cover now. That's supposed to be a Chinese firecracker. A lot of people didn't see that there was fine Chinese print on the side of it. So we've gone from abuse memoir to terrorism memoir to this French version of the book, which doesn't even have a family of the cover. So it's just Nigel No Friend's memoir. And then the current iteration of the book, which is a memoir about having a medical condition where too much water is retained in your skull and it expands. And the next iteration of the book, which comes out in January, is this one. And that is not my family. They are the actors who play my family in the SBS Matchbox adaptation of it, the 6-part series that starts in January next year. Now, it's I'm not trying to be like, because I think false humility just makes me gag, but when I wrote The Family Law, I didn't expect there to be screen potential, but that's mainly because it has no structure, and television's all about structure, where's the narrative arc, all that sort of stuff. What's the journey? I mean, my book covers terrain that starts before I was born. It starts from the 1970s. It even goes back further in time to my paternal grandparents in a chapter where I try to nut out why my dad is so peculiar, for instance. And for that, I have to go all the way back into, China, when my grandma and grandfather on my dad's side of the family were deciding that my granddad should move to San Francisco to wire money back. So the point is, it takes place over a huge time period. And some of the stories that I wrote took place when I was a newborn, like the story of my birth is in there. That's because my mum likes talking about it a lot. And there are stories that take place from when I was a teenager right up until my 20s. So, if you're going to make the book a faithful adaptation in terms of the structure, one, it'd be a pretty messy TV show, and two, you'd be casting a lot of people. So one of the first discussions that we had was, so Tony Ayres, actually I should give you the backstory. So Tony Ayres is right in the back of the room. He approached me, which was a real thrill because, I don't know if I've even said this to Tony, but I totally knew who Tony Ayres was. I was a huge fan of his work and I tried to play it cool and I probably didn't pull it off. But Tony, somehow the book fell into Tony's lap and he really liked it. And I guess by that stage, there was some talk about what this would look like on screen, and some other people had come up with their own ideas about what the family law could look like on screen. I think there was one idea floating around like it could be Little Miss Sunshine, but Asian. Or something like that, which I totally watched, but it wasn't the thing that we were making. And what we both agreed on was that the show was very much an Australian story in a lot of ways, but there were all these sort of typicalities of Chinese families that were in my family that you didn't actually see on screen. You didn't read much about in books, like that really frank humor about bodily functions. Like that's a pretty Chinese thing that I encounter in my family and a lot of others, but not one that was very familiar to audiences. And I guess the other thing that really heartened me about our discussions about it was that fundamentally this wasn't going to be a show about race. That's probably one of the selling points in a way. One of the things that we'll talk about a lot is that this is a show with an Asian Australian family at its centre, and that's groundbreaking in its own way. But we weren't gonna make the show about it. At its core, what we decided on was that this was a show about a family falling apart at the edges over one hot Australian summer. And I think a lot of us who've come from families where the parents have split up can probably relate to that. And that was really going to drive the story through. I guess the other thing that I was really happy about, so one of the things I was happy about is that even though 1 in 10 Australians identify as having significant Asian heritage, so essentially 1 in 10 Australians is Asian Australian, we don't see that on screens very often. There's a reason for that as well, because when you go to the States, when you go to the UK, you see a lot of non-white faces. I mean, they're similarly multicultural societies like ours, but we don't tend to see them on screen. The reason why we don't tend to see that on screen in Australia more often is that we don't have diversity mechanisms that other countries and territories do. So, for instance, the BBC, they have diversity enshrined into I think their charter or the policies that they have to adhere to. Channel 4, for instance, in the UK, they came up with a really novel initiative, I think last year, where if people who were in charge of hiring and casting didn't hit diversity quotas, they wouldn't get their bonus that year. And in the States, it's really common for different facets of the industry to have diversity officers, so people whose job it is to maintain diversity. In Australia, we don't have that. I think we rest on our egalitarianism a lot of the time. We tend to congratulate ourselves on how great and easily multicultural we are in society, but that doesn't necessarily always get translated into screen. So 1 in 10 Australians are Asian. 9 out of 10 of the faces in our show are Asian Australian. We just think that's a bit of a corrective. We've also filmed it in Queensland. And what I really like and what I'm happy about is that Queensland, when it's usually seen on screen, is usually sun, surf, sand and boobs, which is, accurate to an extent. I grew up with all of those things in my life. But the Queensland that we're sort of showing is this sort of beachside suburbia, the one that I was familiar with. And even if you didn't grow up by the beach, but you did grow up in the suburbs, it's probably going to be quite familiar to you as well. Even though it's set on the Sunshine Coast, Sunnybank in Brisbane is the stand-in for the Sunshine Coast in here because, it's funny. Sunnybank, 1, is very visually appealing, anyone who's familiar with the area. And 2, I think, the quirks of suburbia are pretty translatable wherever you go, especially in Queensland. One of the questions that I often get asked when people know that we've made a TV show based on a book about my family, they're like, who's going to play you guys? And that was always an interesting question, and I think that's something that Julie and Tony can talk about as well. But in the very early days, when we were developing the show, and it wasn't guaranteed that it was necessarily going to be made, I did ask my mum, in an ideal world, if this show gets made, who would you want to play you? Like, choose any Asian or Asian Australian actor, like who would you get to perform the role of Jenny? And she had to think about it. And then she's like, oh, I think I know. Judith Lucy. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I was pretty taken aback by that. And when I love Judith Lucy, but when I pointed out the obvious, which is Judith Lucy is white, my mum's response was, oh yeah, but she could do the paint and maybe a bit of this. And I think we're getting into grim territory where, some people can't imagine who would play them on screen, that they'd resort to yellowface as a legitimate option. But the cast that we actually got was really fantastic. So Fiona Choi, who plays the role of Jenny, she's based in New York, but she's an Asian Australian actor. And she was I think sending her auditions through video as well. And she just totally nailed it. I remember first seeing her video and I thinking she was amazing. And the role of Danny is played by Anthony Brandon Wong, who splits a lot of his time between Australia and America because there's a lot more volume of work there, and he'll compete against non-Asian actors for the same role, something that he tells me is quite a rare occurrence in Australia. But one of the great joys as well was unearthing relatively unknown actors to play 5 kids, slightly feral Asian Australian kids. And so you're going to be seeing their faces soon. There were some really interesting practical issues that came up as well, like for instance with language. So there is Cantonese spoken and performed in the show as well. So when people ask me, are people happy with who plays them? Well, my family, especially my mum and my dad, actually worked with the actors in making sure that their pronunciation was right, that they're using the same slang, all that sort of stuff. The SBS interpretation and translation department was brought in to make sure that language was accurate and the correct slang was used and all that sort of stuff. And even though we all had sort of reservations or sort of fears about what this could look like, our family being represented on TV, how is that going to work? I think one of the nice sort of icebreakers was when they finally got the scripts, or at least the initial drafts of the scripts, because before then it was this pretty abstract exercise that one of their own was writing about them yet again, and this time on a different platform, probably seen by more eyeballs. But when they got the scripts, and we worked really hard on the scripts to make them funny and poignant, they really loved them, which was great. And the other thing that really helped things was a situation that could have been potentially hideous but was really joyful in the end, which was when the family law met the fake family law for the day they came for their cameo appearances. So that's Tristan Go, who plays me, or a teenage version of me, and everyone else is with the counterparts of their characters as well. And there was a lot of love and affection, particularly on this day. And my whole worry coming into this day was that my family would be really freaked out because, sets are they can be pretty overwhelming for people who aren't used to them as well. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of hands on deck, there's a lot of things going on. But my family they were swept up in the novelty of it all. They thought it was hilarious. Disturbingly, my sisters thought the on-screen brother version of him was very hot. They started perving on their on-screen brother. It was kind of weird. But it was really great. And in fact, I think it was much weirder for the actors because for so long they'd learned these lines, they'd explored this character from the inside out. And now they were meeting these real-life versions of the people who played them as well. So I can't think of too many precedents for something like this happening, except for, of course, Eddie Huang's Fresh Off the Boat, if any of you have been watching that American series, which is looking at Eddie Huang, who's a very sort of famous young Asian American dude. He wrote a memoir called Fresh Off the Boat that was turned into an ABC series, and that very much deals with finding your place in the world as a minority. But that's probably like the only reference point I have for people, meeting their comedy versions of themselves. It's kind of like that weird episode of The Simpsons where Bart and Lisa meet that counterfeit version of themselves. But that's where we're at. I'm happy to take questions later, but I think I might just throw it over to Julie Eckersley, the producer of The Family Law, who wrangled this beast into shape. So come on down, Julie, boss lady.